If you're Australian and you have particularly strong feelings about what we should do with Israel, let me at least ask you this. Do you know where we came from? The recent spat between Netanyahu and Albanese is nothing personal. It's the result of tension that's been building for decades. You see, in 1997, a group called AJAC formed. It was a merger of different pro-Israel groups in Australia and mirrored the pro-Israel lobby in America, AIPAC. This was how our former Foreign Affairs Minister described them.
The Israel Jewish lobby in Australia is a foreign influence operation. It's designed to put the interests of Israel above the interests of Australia and its foreign policy.
That man was Bob Carr, and he clashed with his Prime Minister Julia Gillard over what to exactly do with Israel. However, when she used to be the deputy to another guy, the American ambassador wrote a report home that was absolutely glowing about her defense of Israel within what they considered to be a hostile Labour Party. The infiltration of AJAC goes really deep, and the influence of Israel well predates even their beginnings. For everyone telling Albo that he's weak on the Palestine issue, please at least watch this video to understand the depth of the absolute landmines that are really everywhere that he steps. This video is going to cover the entire history of our relationship with Israel. But first, this video is proudly brought to you by Daily Wire Plus. Now, if you want to know my bias, this is it. I oppose civilian deaths as an instrument of war. I know, stunning and brave.
It's like, well, you gotta work around that!
Honestly, that Bill Burr joke really is the extent of my views on the conflict itself. But what you might not know is the depth that Israel has gone to have Australia in their pocket. Rightfully, Tucker Carlson's interview with Ted Cruz made absolute waves because Cruz did such a bad job of covering for AIPAC's influence amongst American politicians. However, you might not know the story of AJAC, its sister in Australia. But if we are going to understand the influence of Israel in Australia, we have to go back to the last high-profile leader to defy Israel, Gough Whitlam.
The blackmail was exercised by some heroes in the Australian Jewish community on the other side of the world from the hostilities that we should support Israel in the dispute between Israel and its neighbours.
So Australia was actually one of the key players in the creation of Israel. We supported the partition of Palestine into Jewish and Arab territories, and our Minister for Foreign Affairs, Herbert Abbott, was the president of the UN General Assembly when Israel was established in 1948. He was a strong supporter of it, and our Labour government was amongst the first in the world to recognise the new Israel. But in 1949, that Labour government surprisingly lost the election to Robert Menzies, who led the opposition, the Liberals, into a 23-year-long government. And during that period of Liberal dominance, we consistently voiced our support for Israel. The most famous example would be the Six-Day War in 1967. When Egypt blocked off access to the Strait of Tiran, Israel responded with deadly airstrikes, and within 6 days, Israel had occupied the Sinai Peninsula, the Gaza Strip, and then Golan Heights up here. Prime Minister Harold Holt insisted that Israel indeed had a right to defend itself and refused to condemn them at the United Nations. Now, I assume that the Israel defending itself language is pretty familiar to you. But in 1972, Labour finally returned to government under the leadership of Gough Whitlam. And this was crucial timing because in 1973, Israel fought yet another war with Egypt that was called the Yom Kippur War or the Ramadan War, depending on whose side you're on. Remember, Egypt had lost the Sinai Peninsula and Syria had lost Golan Heights. With negotiations for reallocating the territory at a standstill, Egypt and Syria had launched a surprise attack and sandwiched Israel. So this is an easy one for an Australian politician, right? Just say that Israel has the right to defend itself and that they can use whatever means necessary to fight off the invaders. But that's not what Gough Whitlam actually said. In fact, Whitlam said that this came about because Israel had refused to return the territories that they had seized in 1967. He cited UN Resolution 242, which called for Israel's withdrawal from occupied territories and a peaceful resolution to the Arab-Israeli conflict. During the month that the war broke out, an Australian by the name of Lawrence McIntyre was also president of the UN Security Council.
It would have been an appalling thing for us to come down on the side of, on one side, at the time that an Australian was in the key position of President of the Security Council.
This was not only a decisive break from Israel, but a decisive break from their biggest supporters, America. But I'll have another video at the end for you on Gough Whitlam and America. Whitlam actually later made the claim that Israeli pressure groups had blackmailed him, but that he'd refused to back down and to give in to their demands. In response to Western support for Israel, the oil-rich Arab nations placed an embargo on most Western countries. Australia was actually spared from being directly embargoed, but given that it affected much of the supply chain, we were still pretty badly affected. In fact, Whitlam tried to negotiate with Saddam Hussein's Iraq, a country who was rivaling Israel for Middle Eastern influence. He wanted them to spend their oil dollars on helping the government open its very own government-run mines. This only annoyed Israel more and actually led to criticism within his own party. For instance, Kim Beazley Sr. actually called it blood money. Ultimately, Whitlam had to find another source of funding, and that would actually cause the end of his government. Again, I'll have more for you on that at the end of the video. But like Beazley, there was another man within the Labour movement who had an entirely different view on Israel, Bob Hawke. So during Whitlam's stint, Hawke was not yet in Parliament. Instead, he was the president of the Labour Party, which meant that he was involved in resolving internal party disputes and coordinating campaigning strategy. I guess the simplest illustration would be to say that Whitlam was the captain of the cricket team and was actually playing the game, while Hawke was the coach from the sidelines. But Hawke was also the president of the Australian Council of Trade Unions, and the unions were the primary financial backer of the Labour Party. So in other words, outside of Parliament, Hawke was the most powerful person in the Labour Party. In 1969, a Jewish Labour senator called Sam Cohen actually died of a heart attack. In 1971, his widow then invited Hawke to travel to Israel and to actually come back to Melbourne to give a lecture on the country. While there, he made close connections with a group called Histadrut, which is Israel's trade union movement, and even met with the Prime Minister, Golda Meir. You can actually read about it in Troy Bramston's book. Hawke claimed that his fervour for Israel came from a desire to atone for an anti-Semitic attack where, as a teenager, he beat up a Jewish boy. But Hawke didn't just stop there. During the 1973 war, Hawke became the first non-Israeli to visit the Golan Heights battle zone and returned home with photos of what Syrian soldiers were doing to the Israelis. It still gets crazier though. On Australia Day of 1974, Hawke addressed the Zionist Federation in Sydney and explicitly called Whitlam's policy towards Israel as morally repugnant. Remember, this is the party that he's the president of. Hawke threatened to resign his presidency unless Whitlam accepted his pro-Israel stance. In fact, Hawke's pro-Israel credentials were so strong that he became an informant to the US Department of Labor, frequently criticising Whitlam's foreign policy. It still gets crazier though. In 1976, Israel decided to name a forest in the north after Hawke. The Robert James Lee Hawke Forest is still there today. So Hawke clearly wanted to get Labor back to their pro-Israel days under Herbert Abbott. In fact, the pro-Israel riots still hold him up as a hero today.
Bob Hawke was a very educated man and a very insightful man. He made the observation that when the bell tolls for Israel, it tolls for all mankind.
And he was an unapologetic supporter of the Jewish people.
Now, to say that Hawke definitely would have been a supporter of post-2023 Israel really is a bit of a stretch. He was actually starting to move away from them towards the end of his life. But clearly, Hawke wanted to re-alter the course of his own party. In 1975, Whitlam lost a very controversial election to the Liberals' Malcolm Fraser, but by 1980, Hawke himself had entered Parliament, and in 1983, he became the leader of Labor and months later, beat Fraser in the election to become the Prime Minister. Hawke would then actually become the first Australian Prime Minister to visit Israel while serving as Prime Minister. And in his last days in office in 1991, Hawke supported UN Resolution 4686. This was a motion that abolished an earlier resolution in 1975, which had said that Zionism was a form of racism and a form of racial discrimination. So Whitlam's brief foray into a stance that was at least somewhat against Israel now felt like nothing more than a fever dream, even within the Labour Party. Hawke eventually lost the support of his own party, and in 1991, they dumped him for Paul Keating.
This week, all of Australia's living prime ministers, except one, Paul Keating, expressed support for Israel and called for solidarity with Jewish Australians in a rare joint statement.
Now, I know for a fact that some of you guys are absolutely ready to go in the comments when it comes to talking about Keating and Israel. That's because Keating's daughter Catherine was filmed visiting Epstein's mansion in 2010 and had an interview with Ghislaine Maxwell in 2014. His ex-wife's name also nearly spells out Israel. Conclusion, Keating definitely works for Mossad, even though he was the only ex-prime minister not to co-sign the pro-Israel letter after October the 7th. If you even do just a brief Google search, you'll find that Catherine Keating got introduced to the Epsteins when she left Sydney in 2010. Paul Keating left office in 1996. Now, Israel wasn't really a foreign policy priority of Keating's, and he kind of just repeated the mantra of Israel has a right to defend itself, but I think he did differ in at least one big way. Hawke had refused to hold any discussions with the Palestinian Liberation Organization. Doing so might have legitimized them as the sole group who spoke for Palestinians and removed the possibility of other more favorable groups. However, in 1991, America actually helped facilitate the PLO have a meeting with Israel and the other Arab nations in Madrid. Officially, the Palestinian delegates were not high-profile PLO leaders, but they were certainly guided by the leader of the PLO, Yasser Arafat, who was down here in Tunisia. Keating felt that to keep freezing out the PLO removed any possibility of a two-state solution, and in 1992, he was happy for them to be engaged. In fact, in the same year, Keating even said that the Palestinian Liberation Organization had played a more positive role in encouraging the peace process over the previous 6 months. Australia's Zionist Federation was furious with this, and they demanded a meeting with Paul Keating. The leader even invited Keating's foreign minister, Gareth Evans, to come and listen to the Jewish community offer their concerns. But time would show that Keating's comments weren't really that controversial. That's because the following year, President Clinton got this iconic photo. It was Yasser Arafat shaking hands with the Prime Minister of Israel, Yitzhak Rabin. These were the Oslo Accords, and they recognised the PLO as at least part of the legitimate government of the Palestinians, and it divided the West Bank into 3 sections. Area A was entirely governed by a Palestinian authority, Area B was under joint control, and Area C was under Israeli control. Gaza would also transition over to Palestinian Authority at some point down the track. Keating welcomed these accords and optimism was high. I mean, for Australia, probably the most optimistic part was that Israel wasn't really part of our policy conversation in the early 1990s. Even in this mega book about Keating, there's not a single thing about Israel. But that optimism would soon come to an end.
אני אומר כאן לממשלת ישראל שמתרפסת בפני האיש הזה. אני אומר לה בשם הציבור הגדול הזה, אנחנו כאן כי לעולם לא ניתן לחלק מחדש את...
Israel's opposition leader was a guy that you might know, Benjamin Netanyahu. He was an ardent critic of Oslo and led huge rallies protesting against the Accords. Rabin responded with his own peace rally, but as he was leaving, he got assassinated by a radical opponent of the Oslo Accords. The crowd of 100,000 scattered in a panic, but many remained to sing the chant, "Bibi is a murderer." Keating expressed his condolences and insisted that peace must continue. It didn't. A newly formed resistance group in Gaza called Hamas responded with a wave of terrorist attacks. Look, 1996 was not a good year for Labour parties. In March, Keating lost to the Liberals' John Howard, and in May, Netanyahu didn't exactly do well, but Labour did so poorly that Bibi could cobble together enough seats to form a minority government. So Netanyahu was in no hurry to implement Oslo, and he kept emphasising the security threat that Israel was under. Howard's stance was that Oslo should go ahead, but that Israel's short-term security was the most pressing concern. For instance, a Jewish Tasmanian mining magnate called Joseph Gutnick was reported to have donated millions to help Israelis settle the Palestinian town of Hebron, as well as donating $1 million to Netanyahu's 1996 campaign. Howard defended this, saying that a private citizen has every right to do with his money as he wishes. And how's this for a quote from the Financial Review, who covered the story? The Zionist Federation of Australia is more supportive of Jewish settlements in the West Bank than is the Israeli Labour Party. Now, up until 1997, the Zionist Federation aimed to build mass public support for the Israeli cause. And by Israeli cause, I mean the hardline Israeli cause. But let's be real, the Australian public pretty much never voted on Middle Eastern foreign policy. So a group that targeted their attention on specific politicians could get a much greater return on investment, and so began AJAC, the Australian Israel Jewish Affairs Council. They were a collection of smaller groups that merged in 1997. Their goal was simple: make Israel's foreign policy concerns become Australia's. At this point, Bob Carr was also the Premier of New South Wales, and this is how he described the influence of AJAC.
I agreed to a request to present a Peace Prize, not awarded by me, but awarded by Sydney University, to the distinguished and respected Palestinian spokesperson, Hanan Ashrari. And all of a sudden, there was a bullying campaign by the Jewish lobby to force me as Premier of New South Wales to pull out of the function.
But in 1999, the domestic landscape of Israel changed. You see, Israeli Labour had formed an alliance with two other groups to become the One Israel Party, and had beaten Netanyahu in the 1999 election. Bibi then retired from politics. However, One Israel fell apart pretty quickly, and in 2001, Netanyahu's Likud party returned to power just months before 9/11. With President Bush declaring his intention to go after any sponsor of Islamic terrorism, Israel had a real opportunity to use that as a pretext to not only go after Palestinian militants, but their sponsors like Iran and Iraq. Remember, after Rabin's assassination, Netanyahu portrayed himself as Israel's defender against the terrorists. And so Prime Minister Ariel Sharon brought him out of retirement and had him be his foreign minister. In fact, in 2002, Netanyahu openly lobbied US Congress to take action against Iraq, who had funded Hamas, claiming that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction.
There is no question whatsoever that Saddam is seeking and is working and is advancing towards the development of nuclear weapons. No question whatsoever.
In Australia, Howard had made the same argument, trying to bring the Aussie public on side with the invasion of Iraq. In fact, in 2002, AJAC actually partnered with the American Jewish community to hold a lunch in honour of Howard and his defence of Israel by virtue of supporting America in going after Islamic terrorism. When Iraq was finally invaded in 2003, Netanyahu was shown to be wrong. Iraq didn't have WMDs. But a key rival for Israel for regional influence had now been nullified. Despite this, Howard stood by his decision to support America in the invasion and frequently invoked the need to fight Islamic terrorism. But in 2006, Howard was forced to directly weigh in on the government of Israel. Rather than talking about the mere enemies of Israel, Howard had to give his verdict on Israel bombing Hezbollah after they had raided this part of the border and killed 3 IDF soldiers and captured 2. But it wasn't just the bombing. Israel then blockaded Lebanon, which garnered much criticism from the UN Secretary General Kofi Annan and France's President Jacques Chirac, who called it a disproportionate level of response. But this was what Howard said: "You could hardly have had a more provocative act. Much as I deplore the violence, one has to understand Israel's position. Israel has the right of self-defense." But Howard wasn't alone in taking this stance. The then Labour leader Kim Beazley Jr., as in the son of the guy who called taking Iraqi dollars as blood money, supported Howard's position. However, by the end of 2006, Labour dumped him as leader and installed Kevin Rudd. Rudd actually went on to defeat Howard in the 2007 election and led Labour back into government. This Labour government would have some big clashes with Israel.
But his comments on Israel's nuclear program have given Israeli officials an unpleasant surprise. In an interview with the Australian newspaper, Kevin Rudd not only called on Israel to join the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, but to open all its nuclear facilities to United Nations inspectors.
So Rudd took a riskier stance on Israel. Following on from the Oslo Accords, Prime Minister Ariel Sharon withdrew from Gaza in 2005. However, in 2006, Hamas won the elections to gain control of Gaza, and in 2007, they ousted the group that had been governing the West Bank, called Fatah. They then proceeded to launch rockets into southern Israel, causing Israel to blockade the entire strip. This approach had been supported by John Howard, but Rudd expressed his concern at the blockade, saying that it only further compromised Israel's security. When Israeli commandos raided an aid ship and shot an Australian on board, Rudd called it deplorable, demanding an end for the blockade and a UN investigation. By this point, Rudd had also been consistently critical of Israeli settlements into the West Bank as well. In 2010, there was also this bombshell news story.
Australian passports have been caught up in the assassination of a leading Hamas militant in Dubai last month. 3 of the 15 new hit squad suspects named by Dubai police were travelling on Australian passports. At least one says he's the victim of identity fraud.
You see, Mossad assassinated a Hamas operative called Mahmoud Ahmabou in Dubai. But in order to get into the UAE, they forged Australian passports of dual Israeli-Australian citizens. They had actually done this back in 2003, and ASIO had made them promise to never do it again. This was Rudd's response.
If Australian passports are being used or forged by any state, let alone for the purposes of assassination, this is of the deepest concern.
2 months later, it was found that the passports had come through Mossad agents who were serving as diplomats at the Israeli embassy down in Canberra. Rudd kicked them out, and according to Carr, this was the response.
There was an immediate request from the leadership of the Jewish community in Australia to speak to the Prime Minister.
This is as frosty as things had been since Whitlam, and these documents right here also tell a pretty interesting story. So in 2010, WikiLeaks released nearly a decade of cables that the US Embassy in Canberra had been giving to Washington. They were profiles of people within the Labor Party, and in them, they actually reveal Israel's stance towards the party itself. Now, I want to make this clear. Israel actually liked Kevin Rudd in the beginning. In 2008, the American ambassador spoke to the Israeli ambassador Yuval Rotem and reported home saying this. Rotem said that Israeli officials would normally have been concerned at the prospect of their defeat by the Labor Party. However, this was not the case because Rudd had long gone out of his way to stress his strong commitment to Israel and its appreciation for its security concerns. But there was someone who impressed Israel even more. Rudd's deputy, Julia Gillard. In 2009, American cables called her the next Prime Minister and actually highlighted her record on Israel. This is what was said about her. Gillard has thrown off the baggage of being from what one analyst called the notoriously anti-Israel faction of the ALP. As acting Prime Minister in late December of 2008, Gillard was responsible for negotiating the government's position on Israel's incursion into Gaza. Left-wing Labour MPs, a group to which Gillard used to belong, wanted her to take a harder line against Israel. Instead, she said Hamas had broken the ceasefire first by attacking Israel, a stance welcomed by Israel supporters in Australia. He also said this. Rotem said that Gillard's public statements surprised many Israeli embassy contacts as being far more supportive than they had expected. In June of 2010, Gillard gave a speech to the Australia-Israel Leadership Forum. The next day, she challenged Kevin Rudd for the leadership of the party. She won. Now, to be clear, I don't think that Israel orchestrated this coup. I mean, the main instigator of the internal Labor Party coup appears to be this Labor politician called Mark Arbib, who himself was an informant to America, who themselves were angry with Rudd's management of China. However, I will say this. Gillard's stance on Israel seems to have been part of the vetting process for who a preferred new Prime Minister would be in the eyes of America.
We are two countries separated by distance but united by values. Liberal democracies that seek freedom and peace. A just and secure Israel as a homeland for the Jewish people is an indispensable part of a just and secure world.
Now, a question that I need to ask you is, are you an aspiring politician who feels like they should probably know more about this sort of stuff? Well, don't be embarrassed by ignorance. History is actually an opportunity to get an advantage over your competitors because you can put a policy into a context that your opponents can't. If you join the think tank, each month a new set of modules comes into your dashboard that goes into detail on one particular part of Aussie history. The Keating's economy modules were an absolute hit. I can also confirm that there are Labor candidates from the 2025 election that are also doing these modules. If you want to join the waitlist for one-on-one tutoring, just click this button right here as well. The link's in the description. But in 2012, Gillard faced a big moment when it came to Israel. The UN was voting on whether or not Palestine should be granted non-member observer state status. Gillard was against this idea and argued that supporting the resolution would threaten the security of Israel. Instead, Gillard preferred a process of direct negotiation between Israel and Palestine so that a state could be formed on Israel's terms, mainly on borders and on forcing Palestinian authorities to dismantle all terrorist infrastructure. Observer status would also enable Palestine to join international bodies like the International Criminal Court, where it could initiate legal actions against Israel. But I guess that time has shown that having an ICC warrant really doesn't change much for the leadership of Israel. Speaking of, by this point, Netanyahu had returned to leadership of Israel and had been their prime minister since 2009. He now officially supported Palestinian statehood, but only if it was demilitarized. So Gillard was clear. We will not recognize a Palestine that Israel doesn't recognize. But there was one complicating factor. Her foreign minister didn't agree. You see, Kevin Rudd didn't just go away after he got knifed. He was suspected by Gillard of undermining her election campaign by leaking to the media, and so to get the leaks to stop, Gillard asked him what he wanted. Rudd wanted to be foreign minister. However, by 2012, Gillard's popularity had tanked and Rudd's was resurgent, which led to him unsuccessfully challenging Gillard for the leadership. Obviously, his position was now completely untenable as foreign minister, so he resigned and Gillard replaced him with that retired New South Wales Premier, Bob Carr. This was what Carr said about Bibi's recognition of Palestine.
When Netanyahu told me, when I was in his office as foreign minister, that he wants a two-state solution, had given a speech only days earlier supporting one, he was lying. The plan all along was to use the settlements to block the prospect of a Palestinian sovereignty being created with the support of the world community on the West Bank.
In other words, Netanyahu was giving the green light to Israelis to come and settle in the West Bank, completely fracturing Palestine's ability to get a continuous land. So he could give all the lip service about Palestinian recognition that he wanted, but his policy was telling a different story. And so Carr wasn't willing to let Gillard have the captain's call on this one. Rather than joining the 9 nations who were going to reject the motion, he instead pushed for Australia to abstain from voting, even threatening to call a party vote on the matter, which would have humiliated Gillard. Of course, this greatly angered pro-Israeli lobby groups in Australia. When Rudd came in 2007, he quickly settled Israeli concerns about a Labour government, but by 2013, there had been an expulsion of Mossad agents, and even under Gillard's leadership, there'd been the abstention from voting on Palestinian recognition. For Israel, a liberal government could not come back soon enough, and thankfully for them, in 2013, Abbott brought them back.
The leader of Australia's Liberal National Coalition Party, Tony Abbott, wants to improve ties with Israel, which he believes deteriorated.
That wasn't AI, by the way. That was a real Jewish news broadcast from 2013. But if everyone did this right now, we could actually have an Aussie history podcast be the #1 history podcast in Australia. Every rating and follow helps catapult us to the top of the charts, and a couple thousand would definitely get us there. We have so many topics that aren't even covered on the main channel. It would honestly mean so much to me if you paused the video right here, clicked on the link below, and gave us a rating. But in 2014, Abbott made his first major move. Australia withdrew support for a UN resolution calling for an end to all Israeli settlement activities in all of the occupied territories. Netanyahu had now been back in office for half a decade and had long continued the blockade on Gaza. In 2014, Hamas kidnapped and murdered 3 Israeli teenagers in the West Bank. In response, Israel launched something called Operation Brother's Keeper. This was an attempt to hunt down Hamas, but saw 10 Palestinians killed, 130 injured, and 600 imprisoned. In the weeks afterwards, the violence badly escalated. Hamas fired rockets into Israel, but most of them were intercepted, though it did result in 6 civilian deaths. But Israel responded by much more effectively bombing Gaza, killing over 2,100 Palestinians, including approximately 1,500 civilians. Abbott voiced his support for Israel. AJAC obviously voiced their support for Abbott, but like with Rudd, his party dumped him in 2015 and replaced him with Malcolm Turnbull. However, Turnbull continued the support for Israel. In 2016, the UN voted on a resolution that criticised Israel for its settlements in the West Bank, calling them a flagrant violation of international law that had no legal validity. Now, this was only a vote in the UN Security Council, so Australia didn't get a vote. The vote was passed 14-0, with even America abstaining and not voting against it. However, Turnbull's Foreign Minister Julie Bishop said that in voting at the UN, the coalition government has consistently not supported one-sided resolutions that have targeted Israel. Now, I don't want to put words in anyone's mouth, but it really does sound like we would have voted against the resolution had we been there. But then in 2018, the Liberal Party dumped Turnbull and installed Scott Morrison. If you're not Australian, the 2010s was basically a huge conveyor belt. But unlike the others, Turnbull didn't stick around to get his revenge, opting to leave Parliament entirely. This created a bit of a problem because the Liberal Party had now become so unpopular that they were in a real struggle to keep hold of his seat of Wentworth. If you're not from Sydney, it's the eastern suburbs which has a massive Jewish population. So the Liberals ran a very heavily pro-Israel campaign. For starters, their candidate was the former ambassador to Israel, Dave Sharma. But perhaps more importantly, at the same time as the by-election, Scott Morrison announced his government's intention to follow President Trump's lead and recognise Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. This is important because Australia's long-standing position has been to have Jerusalem's status be negotiated by Israel and Palestine, and so this was a clear shift towards Israel.
West Jerusalem is the capital of Israel.
Against all the odds, Morrison actually won another term in 2019. In 2021, when violence once again erupted, Morrison condemned Hamas for firing rockets, but crucially not Israel's use of airstrikes in response. Indeed, the Liberals went on to lose in 2022, which brought Labor's Anthony Albanese to the fold.
Why do you believe history will remember him as a weak politician?
Well, look, I'm sure he has a reputable record as a public servant, but I think his record is forever tarnished by the weakness that he showed in the face of these Hamas terrorist monsters.
So Albo joined Labour from that left faction that the Americans referenced. They were known for their opposition to Israel's occupation. In fact, in 1998, Albanese co-founded the parliamentary group called Friends of Palestine, which was a coalition of politicians who fell on the Free Palestine side of the fence. So many had great optimism for what his government could do. In 2021, his Labour Party actually incorporated Palestinian statehood into its election platform, and after beating ScoMo in 2022, he reversed Morrison's decision to recognise Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. However, that was only half of the equation. You see, while Alba was moving further away from Israel, it was actually moving further to America. Just the year before, Scott Morrison abandoned our deal with France to have them build us a fleet of submarines to instead have America build them for us. The AUKUS deal also agreed to expand intelligence cooperation with America and Britain, which even further entrenched us as an ally of America's. Albanese voiced his intention to support the new deal. Now, many of you guys, including me, are no fans of this AUKUS deal at all. But to cut Albo some slack, if he just walked in and cancelled the deal, it would ruin our international credibility when it came to following through on deals. I mean, every country would just look at us and see a country that might back out depending on which party was in government. It's why foreign policy is a bipartisan thing in many countries. In 2023, Albo appeared with Biden and Sunak and recommitted Australia to the AUKUS deal. Now, at this point, this was a line that could be towed. We could move away from Israel without jeopardizing our relationship with America. But when Hamas launched their biggest ever attack on October the 7th, that became a whole lot harder. From October of 2023 to October of 2024, America provided $17.9 billion in military aid to Israel, its highest annual total ever. This aid included arms, bombs, missiles and jets, which were used to invade Gaza in an attempt to drive out Hamas and free the hostages. The US also deployed naval assets to deter attacks from Houthis over here and from Hezbollah over here. President Biden repeated the age-old mantra that Israel had a right to defend itself. So the attack forced a wave of support from America, and Albo was in a diplomatic bind. If he expressed support for Israel's casualty-heavy invasion, then he would have explicitly endorsed an attack on Palestinian civilians. If he condemned the invasion, he not only had to deal with an angry Ajax, but also had to oppose his main ally. There was no easy way for Australia to untangle itself from its web of alliances. So Albanese repeated this line.
Israel has a right to defend itself, but how it defends itself matters as well.
During the beginning of the new stage of the war, the main critics of Albo were definitely the pro-Palestinians. Under the Labour government, Australian companies could export components to America, which were then refitted into F-35 jets, which were supplied to Israel. Albanese also froze $6 million to the United Nations Relief and Works Agency after Israel accused 12 of its staff of being involved in October the 7th. In fact, a Sydney law firm called Birchgrove Legal even referred Albanese to the International Criminal Court. But as 2024 progressed, it was the pro-Israel camp that was put offside by Albanese. When an Australian aid worker called Zomi Franken was killed by Israeli strikes, Albo told Bibi that he had to provide full accountability to those responsible. As footage of the occupation was broadcast into homes, Netanyahu's popularity tanked, and this was made worse when the ICC issued an arrest warrant for him in November of 2024. By this point, Albanese had voted against Israel at a number of UN resolutions, including a 2024 one which condemned Israel for restricting aid into Gaza. Tensions between Albo and Bibi had reached breaking point, and in December of 2024, they spilled over. After a synagogue was firebombed in Melbourne, Netanyahu wrote this: "The burning of the Adas Israel synagogue in Melbourne is an abhorrent act of anti-Semitism. I expect the state authorities to use their full weight to prevent such anti-Semitic attacks in the future. Unfortunately, it is impossible to separate this reprehensible act from the extreme anti-Israel position of the Labor government in Australia." Netanyahu hadn't just criticised Australia, but had singled out Labor. In my mind, it was a clear attempt to wedge Albo in between the two camps that were angry with him for the upcoming 2025 election. For Israel's perspective, the Liberals' track record was immaculate and would be a much more preferable option than Albanese's moderated approach. But more on that firebombing in just a moment. In April of 2025, Trump launched a wave of tariffs on all sorts of nations, including its loyal ally Australia. Functionally, this gave Albanese some wiggle room to decouple Australia from America. In May of 2025, Albanese smashed the Liberal government and won with a far greater majority than they had before. But for Bibi, his popularity had slid so hard that now even most Americans had an unfavourable view of him. So with a mega domestic majority and anti-US and anti-Israel sentiment running high, Albo finally had enough political capital in the bank to go ahead and do what he wanted to do in his first term and recognise a Palestinian state. Hamas was to have no say in this new nation, but crucially, this broke the policy of having Israel negotiate the borders of the new state. For Bibi, Albo had sunk the final nail in the coffin and had ended Australia's long-standing position of unwaveringly supporting Israel. Now, don't get me wrong, the Palestine March was, in my opinion, a great show of peaceful protest, but I don't think it forced Albo's hand. Labor had signed themselves up to this policy back in 2021, but was waiting for the right political climate and wanted to time it before the UN met in September. But as I've been making this video, there's been one final twist to the Israel story. Remember that Melbourne synagogue that got burnt down? Well, Albanese claimed that the arsonists were working on behalf of a nation state, Iran. Except a lot of people don't quite get the motive for Iran doing this. However, there would be a very strong motive for Israel doing this. The burning of the synagogue was brilliant political ammunition for Israel, as it legitimized their appeal to righteousness in that opposing the government of Israel always results in increased anti-Semitism. If anything, this would only work against an enemy of Israel, but it could functionally serve as a bone that could be thrown to the Israelis after relations had broken down. Look, I'm just stating what the popular conspiracy is. I have zero evidence for it and don't know if it's worth believing. We'll have to wait for the government to become a little bit more transparent with the evidence. However, a conspiracy theory that I do believe in is that the CIA were responsible for ousting Gough Whitlam. An ex-US intelligence officer has even explicitly said this.
Well, yes, Mr. Whitlam was not a popular figure at all, to say the least. Did they say why?
Click right here to watch it.